Published in 2020 by American author P. Djèlí Clark, Ring Shout is a historical Southern Gothic fantasy and horror novella that was nominated and won several awards that year in several different categories, including the 2020 Nebula Award for Best Novella. It was also nominated for the Best Horror category of 2020 on goodreads.com, and it did not win, but it has received various accolades for its originality, I suppose. The story occurs in 1922 Macon, Georgia, where a monster butcher and his demon minions called Kluxes are growing in power and influence within the social world of humanity, and only the protagonist, a young woman by the name Maryse Boudreaux, can thwart these plans. The book is rated 4 stars out of 5 on Goodreads, and that rating was averaged from over 34,000 reviews. So this is an interesting story because I believe there's both little to say about it and also a lot to say about it. Now, the little to say about it regards the narrative, because the story itself is pretty short and simple. It follows Maryse on a hero's journey to save the world from monsters, and these Kluxes, the monsters, are these cone-headed beings who infiltrate humanity and feed off of humanity's hatred for one another. Obviously, the cone head idea comes from the cone-headed shape of the KKK robes, and so the idea is that these monsters can fit in well in a society that wears cone-headed robes. Now, Maryse carries a magical sword, and it's powered by the spirits of the world history's enslavers, while her nemesis is a man named Butcher Clyde. Now, she is part of a magical black community in Macon, and they attempt to utilize a ritual called a ring shout to channel the magic of their ancestors, all the while trying to combat the growing power of the Kluxes as they threaten the whole world. So, in terms of narrative, not too much to say, but I believe there is a lot to say about the context of the narrative. Now, since this is a Southern Gothic novella from the 1920s, the context, of course, is that of a segregated American South, and the lives of everyone who received and perpetuated this racial animus. Since that period of American history has fallen under particularly, increased popular scrutiny in the past few years, I believe that one could make the argument that a book like this is more relevant now than it would have been in the recent past, as it gives readers some real-world reference points for things that happened in our reality. So, for example, it uses the historical fiction genre. And so what historical fiction does is it blends truth of our world with a fantasy world to bring attention to several real people. Like, in this case, D.W. Griffith, Thomas Dixon Jr., and the film The Birth of a Nation. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about these people in this film and set the stage for the context of this novella. So D.W. Griffith was a filmmaker who created the movie studio United Artists and also created and produced the movie The Birth of a Nation, which this was back in the early 1900s. It was very groundbreaking for its time. It's technically a brilliant film. It was the first film in America to feature close-ups and fade-outs, a musical score, and it was the first film screened at the White House to President Woodrow Wilson. Now, adjusted for inflation, it is technically the most commercially successful film of all time. It was released in 1915, and it was originally called The Klansman, based on a book, and many believe that this film was itself instrumental in the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. Now, in the universe of the book, the monster Ku Kluxes plan to use a public showing of this film as a magical ritual to usher in a second wave of national hatred for black people. Thomas Dixon Jr. is also another historical person referenced in this novella. His publications promoted white supremacy, especially including a book that inspired the film called The Klansman. And that was in 1905. Now, within the book's universe, both Dixon and Griffith were these conspiratorial dark sorcerers. And I've mentioned this type of writing in my review of The Terror, but I often question using real-world historical people as villains in works of fiction. I think that doing that, it does ground a novel in realism, but I think it also runs the risk of maligning a person's reputation, whether or not that's deserved. The reality is that these men, Griffith and Dixon, were probably not dark sorcerers, and so I just wonder about that additional blemish to their character. It just feels kind of like overkill to me. And by the way, I feel the same way about films that are based on a true story. If I read a book or I watch a movie set in the real world, I'm more interested in getting the facts about a person's life and then drawing my own conclusions based on what I've seen. However, even with all these considerations, I can see creativity in this particular angle. The book makes me, it feels to me like it's making an attempt to understand why some people in history acted the way they did, almost as if it's making more sense to chalk up the sin of American racism to some sort of supernatural monster rather than just simple human evil and prejudice. But with all this being said, you would think that the mood of a novel like this would be gloomier, but it's actually more humorous than sad, and it's more whimsical than horrific. The novel itself is marketed as a horror novel, but to me, it actually feels a lot more like a fantasy book. I found that the subject matter is very similar to Matt Ruff's book called Lovecraft Country, and that was released years ago, and I actually reviewed that in one of my earlier episodes. There is room in Southern Gothic fantasy, but I think that his book was really the more original of the two. The sad moments in this story are undercut by kind of some cartoonish violence, and the plot resolution and Maryse's hero's journey are fairly predictable, because the theme of this book wants to focus on justice, but actually it drifts more to good versus evil as its main theme. As I always do in my episodes, I want to talk about some tropes. The first one I noticed here is called the Hecate sisters. Maryse is given her magical sword by these three female spirit guardians called haints in the old Southern vernacular, and these three women are the most interesting figures in the story, but they fit very nicely into this trope, the Hecate sisters, which sees three women representing three different female extremes personified in the figures of the maiden, the mother, and the crone. Hecate was the Greek goddess with three faces, and once you see this particular trope with three women portraying three different personality types, you see this trope everywhere in pop culture. Shakespeare, I think, was one of the first. He had the three weird sisters in Macbeth, and even older than that were the three female fates in Greek mythology. Usually these women are depicted with personality extremes, and in this book, Clark gives them this extra twist by making them fox spirits in the shape of women. Now, this trope in itself can often be confused with what's called the Three Faces of Eve trope, where you have the mother and crone figure combined into a singular mother figure, while the maiden is divided into two different figures. One is an innocent child, and one is a sexualized seductress. But here, they are fulfilling nicely the Hecate sisters, and this trope works because there's something really interesting about three witches, or three magical characters, that really round out magical lore for some reason. Now, speaking of characters, let's talk about Maryse. She's kind of a Mary Sue trope in that her one and only character flaw is internal doubt. Her journey involves her trying to overcome her internal doubt, which, I know people feel strongly about the Mary Sue trope, but I think that's pretty much the case with her. The other characters are not the best developed characters I've ever read either, with the other standout character named Sadie Watkins. She's the typical action girl trope. So basically, she is Letty from Lovecraft Country. And of course, this wouldn't be a correct Southern Gothic if there weren't a Mamie character as well, while the main villain is a fat white bastard trope. So in conclusion, Ring Shout is a good short fantasy read. I don't see it as a horror because it lacks the most basic horror element, which is fear or intent for fear. But if you go into it knowing that you're actually going to get fantasy, I think you'll have a better time. The world of Ring Shout is interesting, and I was introduced to several real-world people and concepts like The Ritual of the Ring Shout, that have given me a better understanding of our real world. The novel does have a payoff that isn't the most original, but I do appreciate how Clark goes out of his way to separate the Kluxes from the human villains. And currently, in our current political climate, I appreciate that because it does kind of make me uncomfortable when you have certain characters in a story, whatever their race, particularly singling out another character as evil just because of their race. And I think Clark walks a pretty fair tightrope in doing this well in his story. If you want a quick fantasy read that dabbles in 1920 race tensions, this book is probably going to be what you're looking for. And for all the reasons I mentioned in my review, I give Ring Shout 3 stars out of 5. If you like my show, please help me out by liking and subscribing. If you want to hear me review a certain book, let me know in the comments of my YouTube channel. I'll see you in the next episode, and until then, happy reading.